If you were growing up in Lee County 100 years ago, or maybe during the 1800s, chances are you wouldn't be in school today. You'd be helping your family on the farm. Back then, you probably lived 5 or maybe 10 miles, or maybe even 15 miles from town. If you wanted something, you couldn't just run to a Walmart or CVS pharmacy to pick up some medicine, or to a Publix or Kroger. They didn't exist. You had to raise and make all the tools that you used on the farm. You had to do it, or your dad had to do it, or you had to have a neighbor do it. So on that farm where you lived, you had to raise everything that you used, everything that you ate, everything that you fed the chickens, the horses, the mules, the cows, the pigs, the animals, the livestock that you grew on the farm. You had to raise it. In 1819, when Alabama became a state, settlers rushed in to take advantage of this new land so they could grow field crops. Field crops are crops that are planted on big acres. In fact, a typical farm family might have about 40 acres of land. There were field crops, and then there were cash crops. Cash crops are just field crops that are grown for money, or that you could exchange for goods at the local general store. The biggest crop grown in Alabama was a cash crop. Do you know what it was? It was cotton. In the 1800s and in the early 1900s, you could make money if you could grow cotton. You can't eat it, you can't feed it to the chickens, you can't feed it to the pigs, but you can sell it and make money off of it. And a lot of farmers moved here from Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, moved into Alabama to grow this crop called cotton. But cotton takes a lot of labor. It takes a lot of work to produce cotton. Many of the white settlers bought African slaves to work the fields and grow this crop called cotton. After the Civil War, cotton still became important. We still grew a lot of cotton, but then it came under a system called sharecropping, where the freed slaves and the poor white people that lived on the land could grow cotton and share a portion of the crop with the landowner. And that's the way most Alabamians lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s, by sharecropping. Cotton was a very important cash crop, and the family spent most of the year working the cotton, planting it now, keeping the weeds out of it in the summertime, keeping the bugs off of it, and then harvesting it in September, October, and November. Cotton picking time was an important time in Alabama. In fact, a lot of counties 100 years ago would just close the schools in September and October for cotton picking time, because even if you didn't go to school, you would be helping your parents pick the cotton crop. Cotton could be taken to the local gin, and at the gin, the seeds would be removed. The gin would keep the seeds for the cost of ginning the cotton, and then cotton would be placed in these big 500-pound bales, which could then be loaded onto a wagon or on the railroad car, hauled to maybe Montgomery or Columbus, Georgia, and put on a riverboat. And that riverboat would carry the cotton to the port, and it would be shipped to New England, or even to England or to France. And the farmer would be paid cash for it. So that was an important crop. Farmers liked to grow cotton, but they still needed to eat, and you can't eat cotton. Corn was an important food crop. The Creek Indians that lived here grew corn, and they taught the early settlers how to grow corn. So corn has always been an important crop. Pioneers loved it because it grows well here in the South, and it keeps well in the winter. corn is planted in the early spring, and the farmers would save the seed from year to year to plant the corn in their fields, and the kids would be very much involved in planting the corn, in that the dads would walk along and dig a hole, and the kids would come back and drop the corn in the hole and cover it up. So it's important that the kids work on the farm. There's nothing wasted on the corn. When it's growing on a stalk, the farms, they would harvest the stalks and feed it to the cows during the winter. When the corn is shucked, they can take this shuck, and remember, there were no stores back then, so you couldn't buy toilet paper. Guess what was a substitute on the farm for toilet paper? Not very comfortable, but you got by with what you had. Also, when they removed the corn from the cob, the corn cob could be used to start fires in the fireplace or in your wood-burning stove in the wintertime. But corn keeps very well during the winter, and that's what the pioneers liked about it. They could put it in a barn or in a shed, and they could feed it to the chickens during the wintertime. They could feed it to the milk cow. They could feed it to the horses and the mules and the pigs that were living on the farm. So it was an important crop for feeding the livestock during the winter. Plus, during the winter, your dad may take a load of corn down to the local mill to have it ground down into corn flour, and maybe even grits. And that was the main food crop for the farm family, along with the chickens, the cows, the pigs, the horses, the mules, everything that lived and worked on the farm. Everybody depended on cotton. And a terrible thing happened in 1911. A little insect called the Mexican boll weevil moved into Alabama from Mexico and started devastating the cotton crop. It would lay its eggs inside the newly developed boll on the cotton plant, and that would cause the boll to fall off. So come September and October, there was no cotton to pick. There was no money to be made from this important cash crop. So farmers were desperate. There was a professor at what was then known as Tuskegee Institute named Dr. George Washington Carver. At that time, he was doing research with a fairly new crop called peanuts, or some people call it ground nuts, some people call it goobers, some people call it goober peas. A lot of farms grew it, but mainly to eat and maybe feed to the pigs. But Dr. Carver invented a lot of new uses for peanuts. And the nice thing about peanuts is that it would grow on land that had been worn out by growing cotton, which is true for much of the sandy soils of South Alabama from Lee County south. So some farmers started growing peanuts, and a new mill was built down in South Alabama that could process peanuts into peanut oil and other products. And suddenly, these farmers were able to make money again. And peanuts today is the second biggest crop that we grow in Alabama behind cotton. In fact, the city of Enterprise, Alabama, just about 100 miles south of here, erected a monument to the little insect called the boll weevil because it forced them to start growing peanuts instead of cotton. And that saved many of the family farms in that part of Alabama.